This is the fourth screencast for Chapter 3, and in it we are going to begin by looking at the carbon cycle. Again, despite the fact that there are numbers on this diagram, it is a cycle, and carbon moves through it in various ways. So we're going to begin with the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Remember, carbon is the C here, and the dioxide are the two oxygen atoms that are also attached to that carbon. And CO2 is brought in through photosynthetic organisms and converted into sugars. And then eventually those sugars are converted back into CO2 through respiration. So some of the carbon is captured here by producers through photosynthesis. Some of the carbon cycles through consumers and decomposers. And through all of these steps, both the producers, the consumers, and the decomposers respire. They do a process in which they obtain energy from the food and then release it back into the atmosphere. So the CO2 is released back into the atmosphere. And not only that, we have some carbon that is not released back as CO2. Some of it gets trapped and becomes buried, and that buried earth, if it stays that way, that buried carbon-containing material, if it's buried for millions of years, become what is known as fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, and coal. And they're called fossil fuels because they are formed from the remains of what was originally live biological material, and it's been buried for millions of years. So the other natural process is shown here on the left, and that is that there's dissolved CO2 in water as well. We often don't think of it that way, but oxygen and CO2, which are both important to living things, are also dissolved in water such as the ocean. And that's dissolved CO2 is taken in by photosynthetic organisms in that ocean water, where it again cycles through producers, consumers, decomposers, all of which respire and release CO2 back into the ocean. And some of it also remains behind and is buried. Okay, so there's several ways in which humans have affected the carbon cycle. One of them is from extracting fossil fuels that have been buried. So carbon that's been buried for millions of years is suddenly burned, combusted, and then that CO2 is added to the atmosphere. And that's CO2 that has not been in the atmosphere for millions of years. So that increases the total amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. In addition, there are fires, some of which may be natural and some of which are human-caused. But fire is often used to clear agricultural land, to turn it from forest or other type of plant life to agricultural fields. And that CO2 also adds to the atmosphere. It's no longer in those plants in this higher productive manner. And so that also increases the CO2 in the atmosphere. And a third way that we might not think about so readily, but we've talked a little bit about water and some of its unique properties, but one thing to know about water is that the warmer it is, the more it releases CO2 into the atmosphere. So if we have climate change occurring and those ocean temperatures increase, that also increases the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And then you get that positive feedback loop, which is not a positive thing, but then more CO2 in the atmosphere leads to warmer temperatures, which would lead to more ocean water releasing CO2. So that's the story of CO2, and I'm going to move on to nitrogen cycle next. Okay, so you can already tell just by glancing at this diagram that the nitrogen cycle is a very complex cycle. And I will walk you through it, but I want to point out a few major things and then again focus on how humans impact the nitrogen cycle. So the first point that I want to make is that the atmosphere is made of 78% nitrogen in the form of N2. which is two nitrogen atoms bound together. And it's still called nitrogen. So 78% of our atmosphere has nitrogen in it. So that's a tremendous amount of nitrogen available. And nitrogen is absolutely critical. In addition to carbon being critical to biological life, nitrogen and phosphorus are also critical because those are needed to build RNA and DNA and protein, which is life as we know it. And the hitch here is that this atmospheric nitrogen, N2, is not usable to the vast majority of photosynthetic organisms. It's not usable to be converted into any form. So it has to go through a cycle where that nitrogen is converted into a form where plants can use it and take it up. So we have two pathways to have this nitrogen enter plants. And the first pathway is through biological organisms, which convert it to ammonia, which eventually converts it to a form that plants can take up. And that occurs by certain bacteria that are associated with the roots of plants. A second pathway is abiotic. It could be natural, such as lightning or combustion. And then in that case, the nitrogen molecule is converted to nitrate, which can also be taken up by plants. In addition to the natural biotic pathway where nitrogen is fixed, and the natural abiotic pathway, such as lightning and natural fires, there's a third pathway by which humans convert nitrogen into nitrate, and that is by combusting using fossil fuels, natural gas usually, and combusting it and turning it into fertilizer. And we do so much of that we are affecting the nitrogen cycle, not in terms of how much nitrogen is available in the atmosphere, because there's so much available that we're really not going to be altering the atmospheric portion of the cycle. But we are introducing tremendous amounts of nitrogen to the soils, which will leach and get into the water bodies, which, since nitrogen is a limiting factor for them, will tend to grow bacteria more rapidly. And we'll talk about that when we talk about water pollution. But that is a huge component of converting the nitrogen cycle by having too much of it on our soils, and then it runs off into our water bodies. The other factor with relying on prepared or fixed nitrogen to fertilize our fields is that doesn't add in any carbon to the agricultural land, and therefore we lose some of the productivity. Okay, and then last step of the nitrogen cycle is denitrification. It's a series of steps in which certain bacteria are able to convert the nitrate into nitrous oxide, which eventually turns into nitrogen gas, N2 again. Also, importance to note is the nitrous oxide is also a pollutant, an air pollutant. Okay, the last one that we're really going to look at is the phosphorus cycle. And phosphorus is non-atmospheric. So phosphorus, like nitrogen, is a limiting nutrient. Plants, again, need it for DNA, RNA, and proteins. And it gets into the cycle through weathering of rocks. And that contributes phosphorus to soil and also to water bodies. And that phosphorus can also be introduced. It can be introduced in larger quantities through phosphate mining, purposefully getting larger quantities of phosphate from a particular area rather than the slower process of weathering. And that again is used as fertilizer applied to fields. And then, like the nitrogen, it can also run off and become part of the pollution of water. Okay. So that's all I'm going to say about biogeochemical cycles for now. We're going to look briefly at disturbances of ecosystems, both natural and human, and then we'll move on to another screencast on weather and climate. So briefly, we're going to look at the fact that ecosystems respond to a disturbance. A disturbance is an event in which a physical, chemical, or biological agent changes what happened, what lived there, the population size or the composition of the community. And it can be caused through natural causes, such as a hurricane, or it can be caused by anthropogenic, which again means human-caused or human-generated activity. So here we have an example of a natural ecosystem disturbance where an area, this appears to be Florida, was hit with a hurricane. You can see it changes the amount of beach area, it's added debris to the water, and that's going to change the ecosystem. There are also many anthropogenic ecosystem disturbances, including human settlements, so the expansion into the suburbs and building more and more, agriculture, clearly, air and water pollution, clear-cutting forests, and strip mining. And some systems will be able to better weather these disturbances than others. So, for example, in Florida, they have the mangroves, and mangrove forests are all along the coastline, and they protect the inland parts because when a hurricane comes through, they're able to absorb a lot of that force of energy, that wind energy, and that water surge that comes along with a hurricane. If we take down those natural systems through anthropogenic activity, which a lot of places in Florida do, they take down those mangroves so that people can have just direct waterfront view and waterfront access. But as a result, the damage to the beaches and to the homes and high-rises is increased because we don't have that ecosystem there to respond to the disturbance. Briefly, I'll just say watershed studies. A watershed is a land area that eventually contributes its water and all its chemicals to a body of water such as a river. And by studying these watersheds, we can have a better understanding of the biogeochemical cycles, but that's really all I want you to know about those. Okay, next up will be weather and climate.